And what I want to do now is to point out that certain things are going to come out differently depending on which criteria we use. Consider, for example, the question of smoothing. Now, this is something that I talked briefly about when we were discussing compression. You remember, it's when we have a word like going, where you're going, and we optionally get rid of the second element of the diphthong. So that rather than going, we might say go. Where are you going? Where are you going? Or the other example, fire, where we've got I plus Again, we lose the second element of the diphthong, giving us fire. Come and sit on the fire. Now, sociolinguistically, it's clear that in the upper class, upper middle class, at least among people of my age and older, it is the norm for smoothing to happen. It's not compulsory, but it usually does happen. So unless I make an effort not to, I'll tend to say far, and where you go. There is some suggestion that among younger speakers of RP, this is not so widespread as it used to be, but it's still clearly part of the possibilities, part of the range of possibilities. On the other hand, if we ask about the ideal pronunciation, can you imagine a concerned parent or a concerned teacher correcting a child for saying going or for saying fire? Most certainly we cannot. There is no notion at all that smoothing is something you ought to do. On the contrary, if there's any view about it at all, it's that it's a rather slovenly or lazy habit that ought to be discouraged. So we have a clear mismatch here between the sociolinguistic description of reality and the idealistic description of what ought to be. From the point of EFL, English phonetics, again, we don't prescribe it, though I think it's advisable for people to know about it just to avoid misunderstanding. There was a misunderstanding involving a Swede who was invited to a fancy dress party, and they said, all the men are coming as pirates, so you do the same. Now, he heard that as parrots, and so he went dressed as a multicolored bird, as a parrot. But what the person said to him was, the men are all going as pirates. Pirate. Aha! Pirate. But with smoothing, giving parrot, which is easily mistaken for parrot. Now, if you knew about smoothing, perhaps you wouldn't make that mistake. If you don't know about it, you might. We've got a similar kind of mismatch if we look at the question of intrusive R intrusion. As a matter of fact, it is clear that all speakers of English, certainly upper class speakers, use it. It's very frequent. So if we have a phrase like put a comma in here, it will normally be said in connected speech as put a comma in here. Put a comma in. By and large, the only people who don't do it are those who are making a conscious effort not to do it. Nevertheless, it's certainly not regarded as correct by those who stop to think about it. It's rather obvious mismatch with the spelling, which leads people to write letters of complaint to the BBC or the Daily Telegraph, complaining about people pronouncing letters that aren't there. And again, there'd be no question of criticising somebody for not using an intrusive R. It would be regarded as more elegant. Equally, for EFL purposes, we don't prescribe it, though again, I think it's useful to know about it. Third example is the question of how we pronounce words with WH spelling, like where, what, when. And the fact is that English people pronounce these with a plain W. This is true everywhere except in one or two very small pockets of relic pronunciation, particularly in the very far north of England. Nevertheless, the view persists that it's more beautiful and more correct to pronounce it with qu and say when, where, which, why. The only people who do this, I think we can say, are those who have consciously decided to do so, which does include people who've been speech trained and so on, and have been taught this doctrine that they ought to. But it doesn't really belong in natural speech in England. In EFL phonetics, because of Jones's influence, I suppose, as much as anything, we don't prescribe this, although it is taught to those who learn American English as their model, but not to those taking British English. So we've got those three different examples of points where we might end up with a different description depending on what our criteria are.